Number two, this concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few. And this includes either generals themselves, their family members. So wives often acquired massive estates that they then might pass on to a second husband, or children might marry someone else and then it would pass. So there's a growing cadre of 100 people or so in Rome who are slowly acquiring so great wealth that the average community can't weigh up against it and win anything. And so slowly that wealth is corrupting the republic. Remember, the republic, we have to remember this, the republic is a completely democratic state. There are elections all the time. There are various assemblies that people can get elected to. There are many offices that people can serve in. And so the principle in the year 100 is Rome is a democratic state. It's the biggest democratic state ever built by man up to that time, and the most successful one. So up to 100, it's a success. And people in other parts of the Mediterranean admire Rome for that very reason. There's law, there's protections of rights, there's constitutional protections of rights, there's a legal system with courts and juries. So on the face of it, in 100, this is a great achievement. 400 years old, 500 years old, a great achievement. So, number one, the expansion and the conquest of new territory yielded lots of money and slaves, lots of slaves. Number two, of course, dramatic expansion of the wealth in the hands of the few means that politically, of course, there's greater and greater concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. Here's a nice little group of portrait busts. Romans loved having their portraits made by sculptors. Rome is the most interested in the realistic portrayal of the human being ever to that time. No Greek sculpture ever portrayed someone like Romans did, whereas Romans produced very realistic, like the one of Cato. Look at Cato down on the right. Now, no one would want to look like that, so you know that's realistic. But here are 6 portrait busts. They're all in marble. They're all beautiful. They're all in beautiful condition. They're mostly in Rome. In general, the portrait busts of the great Romans like Cicero and Julius Caesar have stayed in Rome. And so of these 6, all of them are in Rome. You see there's Cicero, 100 to 44. Pompey, his lifelong associate, friend, partner, and enemy, all of those things, 106 to 48. Crassus, 1115, a little bit older, to 53, died in a battle in 53. Cicero, that should be 106 to 43. And Brutus is 85 to 42, so he's the younger generation. He's 15 years younger than Caesar, and that fact is a very important part of the story of Brutus because Caesar has a lifelong love affair with Brutus's mother. And it is possible that he's the father of Brutus. Many people believed that at the time that they were grown-up adults living in Rome. Many people in Rome believed that Brutus was the son of Julius Caesar. And so that scene at the assassination, when Caesar says, "You too, my son," which are his exact words, we interpret to mean that Caesar was literally saying, "You mean my own son is going to join the assassins." But as you can see, Caesar would have been only 15, which wouldn't have been unusual given the stories of Caesar. He was the lover of lots of people, and lots of people's wives. A lot of his lovers were lots of people's wives, including this one, including the mother of Brutus, who was Servilia. Servilia was the sister of Cato, so I'm just telling you that since you've got 3 people linked together on the screen. One is Julius Caesar, his possible son Brutus, and Brutus's uncle, Cato, who's sitting right there next to him, scowling. Cato was scowling most of the time. He disapproved of most of what was going on in Rome, particularly Julius Caesar. He hated Julius Caesar, and he hated him from his youth because he knew that Caesar was his sister's lover. Frequent, on and off. Servilia was married to other people all these years and had other children, but Cato knew that Servilia was really in love with Julius Caesar. That was her one true love, and possibly had given birth to this son. And so Cato was always on the warpath against Julius Caesar, even before he had good reasons to hate him as a politician in the 40s, at the time of 49 and crossing the Rubicon. Cato was a great defender of the Republic even then, but way before, Cato just hated Julius Caesar because he knew that Caesar had been Cato's sister's boyfriend. Pompey was a similar career and similar chronology to Julius Caesar, and by the 70s and 60s, they are of identical power and stature in both the army and politics, and they are brother-in-laws for a period of time when Caesar is married to Pompey's sister. He also hates Julius Caesar for the way Caesar cheated on his sister. So you have two men on the picture there who hated Caesar over affairs with their sisters or marriages. Then, of course, left on the screen of those six is our hero tonight, Cicero. And Cicero is not rich. He is not in the same political power, wealth category of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. He is powerful because of his skillful rhetoric. He is, by everybody's agreement, the most brilliant speaker anyone had ever heard, anybody, and one of the most brilliant lawyers. His career in Rome is the career of a very successful lawyer. He's sort of the Alan Dershowitz of first century Rome, a protector of the downtrodden, in court all the time, protecting the poor, and deriving a huge income from it. So although he wasn't rich at the beginning, he became rich and lived on the Palatine Hill in a nice palace, but nothing like the others. So, it'd be like somebody now who has $5 million and they're visiting Warren Buffett, you got $5 million, so when you're down at the local Starbucks, people think you're really powerful and rich because, you've got $5 million. But then you go to a dinner at the White House and there's Warren sitting next to you and he's got $50 billion and you're just a little peasant. You're just a little nobody peasant. That was Cicero's condition with these other huge figures. And on the other hand, he is able to achieve extraordinary power in Rome. Now, we talked about expansion and wealth and gaining power from it. Well, the best example of all is, of course, Julius Caesar and Gaul, the incorporation of France, Gaul, into the state of the Roman state. I'm not going to call it the empire yet because nobody was calling it that. So into the Roman state. And as the great historian Theodore Mommsen wrote in his brilliant History of Rome, 1901, that there is, I love this quotation, it's such a beautiful summing up, that there is a bridge connecting the past glory of Hellas, meaning Greece, and Rome with the prouder fabric of modern history, that Western Europe is Romanic and Germanic Europe classic, meaning German Europe classic. All this is the work of Caesar. And while the creation of his great predecessor, Alexander, in the East, has been almost wholly reduced to ruin by the tempests of the Middle Ages, the structure of Caesar has outlasted those thousands of years which have changed religions and states. In other words, he created Europe. He created Europe. He created the major fabric of Europe by virtue of this campaign, which you see on the screen, the map of France, the Roman army and its movement straight up to Switzerland, then past the western edge of Switzerland, and then a confrontation with the northern Burgundians, and then sweeping down into the Loire Valley, and finally conquering all of France and bringing it to the Roman Empire. And this wonderful painting, this is a great 19th century painting, isn't that beautiful? Of the confrontation between Caesar and the most brilliant Celtic king, Gaelic king of the Gauls, Vercingetorix, I can never say his name right. In any case, there is the scene. You can see Caesar on his throne, and there's the great king in front of him. The king, of course, became his hostage, went with him back to Rome, was brought back to Rome on a treaty in which the tribal leaders promised to maintain peace as long as their king was alive in Rome. And so he would now live in Rome for some time. And there were many, many figures like this, men who were leaders, generals, heads of some of the regions in Europe who are conquered, and then they're taken to Rome, and then they live in Rome. So there's the great scene with Caesar taking possession of one of the biggest parts of Europe. France is the biggest country in Europe. And it all fell into his hands. He had to apportion everything, hand over parts of different France to different generals of his, and set up whole new capitals, build new cities. Many of the cities in France were built by him, etc. So there's the structure, and out of it comes this enormous power in his hands by the year 50. That's the end of the Gaelic expedition, the expedition into Gaul, which has gone on during the 50s, 58, 57, 56. He comes back to Rome, goes back and back. But by 50, he has brought Gaul into the Roman state and has elevated himself to enormous power. So that is the power that falls into the few with the expansion of the state. Now, the next point that I make here is that one of the results of all this growth was a huge growth of the capital, of Rome itself. And this will influence everything because as the city grows, it's unable to take care of the huge growth. And so there's pressures on the government, on all levels of leadership in the government, on the Senate, on the assemblies, on the army itself, to provide services. Because suddenly there were hundreds of thousands of people who needed water, who needed protection, who needed walls, all the things you can imagine. And so this accelerated the pressure on the government as it faced the other problems I just mentioned: wealth, land holding, and the next one that we're going to turn to, slavery. So the result was that the Roman state, which remember is always headquartered in Rome itself, it's always in the capital, it's always there. And so as this influx continued, the men that we just talked about were going to be both in Rome and confronted with problems in Rome and confronted with the pressure on them to provide services for the huge growth in the population. Many of the people who were flooding into the capital had no work. There was massive dislocation of people on farms because these big landowners like Marcus Crassus were buying up these huge plantations and buying slaves and putting the slaves on the farms and firing all the workers, all the agricultural workers, firing them. So suddenly you had hundreds and hundreds of fired agricultural workers streaming into Rome from, let's say, Tuscany, because their whole territory had gone into the hands of Crassus and his team. We just recently found, the archaeologists, I say we, I'm not out there digging, but we just recently found the first ever slave residence in the countryside. We'd never had anything like this, but they just found it in Italy, a little bit out of Rome. And it shows all the rooms and the structures, and you could see, and there's records and things, so you could see for the first time how these workers in the farms lived. And they lived horrible, horrible lives because they were crowded into tiny little cells, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cells in this huge building that was built for slaves, and that was the life they lived. Crowded into these little cells, then brought out in the morning to work in the fields, fed just a minimum amount of food, and then herded back in chains, of course, herded back in chains to their residences back in these huge warehouses of buildings. So we know more and more about it, and it's, of course, within the purview of these men to do something about it. Of them all, of course, it's Crassus, whose wealth is the key thing to remember when you think about first century Rome, because this wealth was going to pervert the whole structure of the Roman state, inevitably. It was going to buy everything. So it was going to be able to buy offices. Now, you know, that's surprising, isn't it, to think of anybody having enough money so they could like win a Senate seat with their own money. The courts were being corrupted. The courts, which had been the great pride of Rome, were being corrupted with what? Money. Money was buying cases. One prominent Roman bitched like hell when the decision came out on his case. He was acquitted because he had to pay the money for 2 extra votes that he didn't need. So he was bitching to all his friends. Everybody wrote it in their letters, and we still have it, that he was so furious that he'd wasted money on bribes to 2 jurors he didn't need. He'd already won the case. They were superfluous. Corrupting the courts, corrupting politics, corrupting everything that these people could put their hands on. And that was exactly what was happening. Every single thing in the state was being slowly corrupted by the wealth